Hello there. Welcome to our webinar for resilient landlords, looking at how you can protect your properties from flooding. I'm Jed Ramsey. I'm the leader of Project Groundwater. We've got two colleagues with me, Katie, who's driving the slides and put all this together for us, and Rob Pike, who is our lead for resilience. If you'd like to go to the next slide, Katie. And yeah, Rob works for RAB Consultants as a senior property flood resilience advisor, and I work out of Buckinghamshire Council. And between us, we look at a whole range of things as part of Project Groundwater. If we go to the next slide. So just to cover what we're going to talk through today. So we've done the introductions. That was a quick and easy part. I'm going to run through a little quick overview of Project Groundwater, what it is, and then I'll hand over to Rob at that point, and he will dive into what property flood resilience is, what are the benefits of it, and some real practical advice on that as well. And at the end, there'll be some time for Q&A. In terms of questions, there's you should see a Q&A button on the bar, and if you can type these in at any time, and if you want to type any text questions in there, we'll answer them at the end. Next slide. So yeah, Project Groundwater is a 6-year project. We're in year 4 currently. It's part of DEFRA's 200 million Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme, which has around 25 of these projects around the country. And we're looking at innovative solutions to address groundwater flooding, particularly looking at awareness, monitoring flood events, warnings, and then helping communities to be more resilient to groundwater flooding. And next slide, please. And this is just the area we're working across. So the concept of us to develop new ideas, research and innovate, and then try them out on the ground in pilot communities, of which we've got 9 across 5 counties, including, down from West Berkshire through to Hertfordshire at the other end. It largely follows the chalk geology, which is part of the reason for groundwater flooding. Next slide, please. And just a little overview that this is a large partnership project. RAB are one of our key partners, but we do have a range from across the industry, really, including other risk management authorities like other councils, Water Company, the Environment Agency, and then a range of partners that have expertise in both groundwater flooding in general, and working with communities. And at this point, I'm going to pass over to Rob, and he'll take us forward from there, please. Next slide, Kate.
Great, thank you very much, Jed. Just a brief introduction again. So as Jed said, I'm a senior property flood resilience advisor at RAB Consultants. We're a specialist flood risk and resilience consultancy, work nationwide with the Environment Agency and numerous local authorities to deliver property flood resilience projects. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview about what property flood resilience, or PFR, it is, and how it could benefit properties, and how as a landlord it could benefit your property or properties that you may own. So PFR essentially comprises measures that provide a way to reduce flood risk to people and property. So it can comprise measures both on a building, within a building, or away from a building to help move water away and reduce the damage and potential impacts. So as the second bullet point there says, they can be installed to reduce the amount of water, hopefully try and prevent water entering a property, or if water does unfortunately enter a property, try and limit the damage caused. And there are a number of images there that show the sort of different products that could be installed. On the left, there's a flood barrier. So those metal slats drop into the rails either side of the door to prevent water coming in through the doorway. The 2 central images are actually flood doors, so they look like normal standard UPVC or composite doors, but they're actually designed and tested to be flood resistant, to prevent water ingress up to a certain level. And the image on the right is what's called an anti-flood air brick. So water rises and there's an auto-closing mechanism within that air brick that prevents water entering the floor void beneath the property and then potentially rising through the floor. But PFR comprises lots of different types of measures beyond those, including pumps, including sump pumps, including basic things just like sealing cable entry points, pipe entry points. And then internally, you might consider what's called recoverability intervention. So we've alluded to measures that reduce the damage. So that could be alterations to internal fixtures, fittings, and furnishings. That means when water does enter a property, it causes less damage and reinstatement times are reduced and the costs are reduced further. Next slide, please, Katie. So why is PFR important? So I'm sure everyone knows that flooding is getting worse. You see it on the news ever more frequently, and climate change and urbanization means that more people and properties are at risk of flooding than ever before. There's also the issue that some types of flooding cannot effectively be managed through larger catchment scale or engineered schemes, particularly in urban areas. It's difficult to build large engineered schemes when there are a large number of existing properties and buildings that prevent you from doing so. So actually protecting buildings at the building themselves is a key tool in the flood risk toolkit to prevent flooding. And the final point there is that actually by installing property flood resilience measures, you're removing a reliance on others to potentially reduce flood risk and actually empowering yourselves to manage those risks yourselves to protect your property and potentially your tenants as well. Next slide, please, Katie. So what are the benefits of property flood resilience? So I've alluded to the reduced costs and damage. So obviously if water did get into your property by altering furnishings and fittings within the property, you can significantly reduce the potential damage caused and the cost of reinstatement. Similarly, those changed fittings and furnishings might mean that the reinstatement time is significantly shorter. So you might be able to get tenants back into a property a lot quicker than if you needed to fully strip out all those fittings and furnishings and have contractors in to undertake reinstatement works. PFR measures are becoming a key tool in the insurance industry. So historically, a major issue and barrier to insurance, obtaining home insurance, has been flood risk. But insurers now acknowledge that through installation of PFR measures, there's the potential to protect properties from flooding, which significantly reducing the damage and therefore allowing properties to obtain home insurance. And the market is moving towards developing what are called flood performance certificates. So similar to energy performance certificates that every property in the UK will have, a flood performance certificate will show and demonstrate what property flood resilience measures are in place and provide evidence to an insurer that the potential damage to a property will be significantly lower during a flood event than otherwise. And that potentially allows them to obtain home insurance cover that previously they may not have been able to do so. PFR measures can also help protect property value. So again, in terms of just purely acknowledging the risk, but showing that measures have been implemented to address that risk, as well as obviously reducing the potential damage during and following a flood event. That means that the property value can be maintained. And then in terms of the issues for tenants, obviously PFR can help both protect the contents that the tenant might have in the property and also the disruption. So obviously if a property were to flood, a tenant may need to move out of the property for a time while the reinstatement works are going in. But if PFR measures are in place and water ingress is either avoided or significantly reduced, those reinstatement times could be significantly reduced, meaning a tenant can be back in the property much quicker. Next slide, please, Katie. So I'm just going to go over a few landlord responsibilities when it comes to flood risk. So landlords have a legal responsibility to disclose flood risk to tenants. Similar to when any person would be purchasing a property, they might obtain an environmental report that tells them about the flood risk to a property. If a prospective tenant were to ask, then a landlord would need to disclose that information to the potential tenant. A landlord, obviously, given they own the building, has a responsibility to undertake and fund the repairs for any damage caused as a result of flooding. And there's also a legal responsibility for the landlord to protect the tenants and belongings during any reinstatement works following a flood. So if any works needed to be done to ensure the health and safety of the occupants. Obviously, the landlord would need to pay and make sure appropriate measures are in place. And that final point states that if a tenant has to move out of a property during reinstatement, a landlord can continue to charge that tenant for rent even if they're not living in a property, but obviously the tenant has a right to potentially claim back some money or request a reduced rate, and a court order could be put in place to request that reduced rent for the period that the property cannot be occupied. Next slide, please, Katie. So just a bit of practical advice for landlords on how they can look to improve their knowledge of flood risk and how they can help themselves and their tenants protect themselves from flooding. So the key bit of advice really is to initially understand the flood risk to the property. So there are various tools online where you can search through the Environment Agency, through local authority websites to obtain freely available flood risk data. I've alluded to before the environmental reports that you might get when you purchase a property. You can approach those companies privately to obtain a report who would give you information on the flood risk to the property. So there are various sources you can go to. And again, the Environment Agency have a service where you can request flood risk mapping for planning applications and similar, where they might be able to give you flood model data which explains the risk in significant technical detail. And then once you know and understand the risk a little bit better, you'll need to identify what could be done to minimize that risk. And at that point, we would always recommend engaging with a flood risk professional, having a property flood resilience survey done perhaps, or engaging with a flood risk consultant to assess those risks, assess the property and assess the site, to determine how a property might be impacted and what sorts of measures could be implemented to reduce that risk. Point 3 explains about exploring flood insurance cover. So I've mentioned before about the upcoming flood performance certificates. It's always worth exploring with your insurance provider whether they offer flood insurance cover, what level of insurance cover might be available. Through the flood re-scheme, which most insurers are now signed up to, if a property does flood, the property owner can potentially claim up to £10,000 back through the flood re-scheme to fund the implementation of further flood resilience measures at a property. So that's always worth exploring as well as part of the insurance cover in case the worst does happen and the property does flood. There's additional money available there to improve resilience going forward. As a result of the PFR survey, we'd always then recommend actually implementing the flood resilience measures at the property. So those surveys should identify suitable and effective measures for the property itself. And again, there are a number of specialist contractors working within the industry who have products that are certified and tested to a required standard that provides assurance that those products will keep water out of the property. We always recommend, as part of any flood resilience mitigation scheme, that homeowners, property owners, businesses create a flood plan to ensure they know what to do during a flood, whether that's deploying measures, whether that's gathering belongings, moving vulnerable bits of furniture or high value bits of equipment that you might have in your property, raising that, elevating, and then evacuating a property if necessary in good time. That might also include signing up to flood warnings and alerts where available, and just making sure there's a clear plan and procedure in place. In terms of landlord responsibilities, it might be something that a landlord could help to develop with their tenants to make sure that the tenant understands what they would need to do during a flood, particularly if unfamiliar flood resilience measures have been implemented at the property that they're living in. A key part of any property flood resilience scheme is the maintenance of measures. To ensure measures are effective during a flood, they need to be regularly maintained. Lots of different types of measures will have seals. They might have mechanical parts such as flood doors or air bricks. They have moving parts that are reliant on their function are reliant on those parts. So they need to be regularly maintained to ensure that they will operate satisfactorily during a flood. Lots of different suppliers will offer service and maintenance plans with the products they supply, and it's always wise to keep those products maintained. Even if there hadn't been a flood in 1 or 2 years, you never know when the next flood is going to occur. So making sure those measures are maintained is a really key part of their effectiveness. And then the final point is reviewing and practicing and implementing the flood plan. So as I've just mentioned, developing a flood plan that the tenants are familiar with, but then ensuring that they have a good understanding and practical understanding of how to deploy measures or implement them, or who to contact if further assistance is required. So there's lots of different things you can do to improve the resilience to your property and empower yourself and your tenants to increase their flood resilience at your properties. Next slide, please, Katie. So what support is available for property flood resilience? So there are a number of different ways that property flood resilience can be funded. So a lot of measures and schemes are actually funded through local authorities and through DEFRA funding. So typically following flood events, DEFRA will release some funding to local authorities for them to administer for people who have been impacted, and that allows them to access a certain pot of money per property to implement flood resilience measures. So as part of that, typically they would require an independent surveyor to come out and undertake a survey, and then the recommendations will be passed on to a contractor to come and implement those measures. In lots of areas that have been identified at risk of flooding by the Environment Agency or a local authority, they might have obtained funding separately to administer a property flood resilience scheme. So typically they would look to engage with property owners independent of any flood event. It might be areas that are theoretically at risk rather than any areas that have been recently impacted by flooding. But again, those projects will be looking to future-proof the properties at risk in those areas. And then just going back to our role on Project Groundwater. So we're working within 9 pilot communities across the Chilterns and Berkshire Downs. So within those communities, the project will be funding a number of free property flood resilience surveys within those communities to help try and increase resilience from groundwater flooding in particular in those areas. So if you did own a property within any of the 9 pilot communities, you can approach us as a project and we can review your circumstances and identify whether you might be suitable or eligible to receive one of the surveys that are on offer. And then with regards to just further support, simply by searching property flood resilience just online, you'll find a number of resources, but there are also a number of good resources on the following websites. So the Be Flood Ready scheme was a collaborative site that was launched earlier this year, which provides lots of good advice about preparing for a flood and property flood resilience measures. Flood Mary has lots of different resources on her website regarding preparation for flooding, flood resilience measures, and flood recovery. There's a couple of images of the guides available on her website just to the right of the slide. And then the Property Care Association, again, also have some advice on their website. The final link on the slide links to the Blue Pages, so that lists a number of organisations which work within the flood risk sector and might be able to help either undertaking a survey or undertaking a property assessment to identify the risks and provide recommendations of suitable flood resilience measures. Next slide, please, Katie. So that's just a brief overview of all of the issues surrounding property flood resilience, how it can benefit your property, and the considerations that are required for landlords and tenants in tenanted properties. So there's an opportunity now, as Jed mentioned at the start, to leave questions in the Q&A box. If we don't receive anything in the next minute or so, obviously feel free to contact us by other means, and there'll be contacts details just in a minute when Jed closes.
Thanks, Rob. We go to the final slide then. Yeah, here's our contact details. So yeah, thanks everyone for your time, for listening in. I hope you find it useful. If Like Rob said, if there's any further information we can help with, or you'd like to know more about the project, please do get in touch with us directly and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. But yeah, thank you for our speakers and thank you for your time.